Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm a Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Professor of International Relations at American University. I'm also co-director of Bridging the Gap, which is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Frankel Family Foundation. Bridging the Gap provides training and support for scholars who want to engage public and policy audiences. Bridging the Gap is supporting this webinar on rethinking how we teach international relations. This session follows an earlier webinar that we did in May on diversity and inclusion in our field, a recording of which is up on our website at www.bridgingthegapproject.org. Upcoming webinars include a book launch on July 30th for Professor Rupal Mehta on her book Delaying Doomsday, which appeared earlier this year in our Bridging the Gap book series with Oxford University Press. We have a session on August 25th on what to do if your research is disrupted by COVID-19. And then a book launch on September 22nd for Dave Barno and Nora Bensahel's adaptation Under Fire, which is the next book to appear in our Bridging the Gap book series. I'm going to introduce our speakers and then dive right into our conversation. Catherine Urban will be monitoring the questions coming to me, so feel free to submit those via either the chat or Q&A functions. We will acknowledge you by name if we're able to address your question, unless you note that you would prefer to remain anonymous. The conversation is being recorded and will be made available for viewing at the Bridging the Gap website. Our wonderful panelists today are Anjali Dayal, Assistant Professor of International Politics in the Political Science Department at Fordham University; Yi Dionne, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC Riverside and a Senior Editor at the Monkey Cage; Meg Guliford, PhD candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, a Minerva USIP Peace and Security Scholar, and an incoming Penn Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at Perry Worldhouse; Meredith Loken, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a non-resident Fellow at the Modern War Institute at the United States Military Academy at West Point; Paul Poast, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago; and Robbie Shilliam, Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. I did want to say a word about my own experience with learning and teaching IR. I took the introductory international relations undergraduate class in the spring of 1980, which is 40 years ago if you're counting. I took the PhD field seminar in IR at Berkeley with Ernie Haas in the fall of '84. Co-taught the PhD field seminar in the early 90s at Cornell with Peter Katzenstein. Taught BA, MA, and PhD IR at GWU during my 17 years on the faculty there, and then taught Intro to World Politics to the undergraduates at AU in the fall of 2016 with Mike Schroeder. So I've taken IR, I've taught it with leading scholar teachers, and I feel like I'm exhibit A for the way the field is typically understood and transmitted, and why we need a broader rethink of how we too often approach the teaching of IR at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. I'm going to start today with Meredith Loken. She and Kelly Zvobgo sparked a great discussion with their recent foreign policy piece, which opens with the following, quote, "Race is not a perspective on international relations. It is a central organizing feature of world politics." So what does that mean for our teaching and research and how we guide students who are entering this field? Meredith, as you note, we typically frame our classes through the lens of the so-called big three: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And even the latter does not, in general, make race central. How should we move away from organizing our courses in this way?
Thanks, Jim, for organizing this webinar and putting together a literal dream team of excellent scholars for this panel. So I think that one point of pushback to discussions of what I'll call mainstream IR's disinterest, or in some cases, I think actual hostility to talking about race and gender, is that we can't simply chuck the canon, which often either ignores race or sometimes glosses over racism, because it's critical to explaining the development and practice of international relations. And this is particularly contentious, I think, at the graduate level, because graduate seminars in IR, and particularly the foundational seminars, are usually focused around IR paradigms. So generally, right, they move through realism and liberalism and constructivism, sometimes with the English school or the Howard School or feminist thought kind of added as versions of constructivism. And in undergraduate courses, especially in intro to intro to IR lectures, we still often start with or spend a significant amount of time on these paradigms. So this is what we mean when we say in this piece that race is often considered, when it is considered in IR classrooms, as a perspective or a theory for race or non-state, or I'm sorry, for state or non-state actor behavior that offers a competing set of assumptions to, say, liberalism. And this is really where I see the intervention point for how we can organize IR courses and how we can bring race and discuss racism in IR classrooms. So instead of sort of thinking about race as a competing perspective or sort of just another perspective, we can talk about how race shapes those paradigms, assumptions, and expectations. Because race and racism underpin the notions of empire and security, cooperation, and shared ideals that we're already talking about when we're teaching IR. And I think when we ignore that in our classrooms, what that means is that students, including myself, can go entire graduate or undergraduate IR programs without ever talking about race, because race becomes sort of just another perspective on rather than a foundational organizing feature of world politics. This is certainly something I've been guilty of, talking about race as a perspective in my own intro classes in the past. I know that's how a number of us have tried to sort of bridge this gap, if you will. But I think that there are a number of concrete ways that instructors can organize courses that better grapple with how IR is raced and how many of IR's foundational concepts have been mobilized in historically racist ways. So one option is to organize courses by thematic topic rather than by paradigm, especially in undergraduate courses. So there are a number of IR textbooks that already do this. Frieden, Lake, and Schultz, World Politics is a good example that I know a lot of people use in class. It starts briefly with paradigms and then moves through different areas of IR, war, development, IP, climate change, etc. These books often have a really strong paradigm bent, usually realist or pretty liberal, and sometimes they don't engage race. But I think, and this is the sort of second suggestion, those readings can be more easily supplemented when they move through themes than when they move necessarily through paradigms. So to take the world politics text example, that book offers colonization and mercantilism as explanations for development trajectories, but it doesn't talk about slavery. So if I teach that chapter, I also assign work about how the transatlantic slave trade also helps us explain development outcomes. And one great thing about this moment in particular is there's a lot of public-facing work, right? Blog posts, policy pieces about the racial dynamics of IR, which I have found really successful in my own experience, assigning to students because they're straightforward and they're sort of comparatively short. So in that vein, there is also just a lot of great work on race and IR that covers all the areas of IR that we're already talking about, and they can be assigned and discussed in conjunction with textbooks or on their own. A great example is a book that Robbie is a co-editor and author in, which is Race and Racism, International Relations, Confronting the Global Color Line. That book has chapters that engage theories of IR, colonization, the Cold War, international law, all these things we're already talking about. So instead of sort of tossing out what you're already teaching and assigning, we can always complement it with other work that's already out there that offers these really robust understandings of racial dynamics. My last suggestion for now, I think, is that you can organize your courses more critically by not teaching them from a traditional IR standpoint. I think mainstream IR, especially in the US and Europe, often in the classroom, really turns into a history of colonial Europe and an explanation of modern Western engagement in the world. And so IR often gets taught from this perspective, either implicitly or sometimes, unfortunately, pretty explicitly. That doesn't have to be the case. There are great texts out there. Arlene Tickner and Karen Smith have a new book, for example, called International Relations from the Global South, which engages the same areas as, say, for example, the Frieden, Lake, and Schultz book, but it prioritizes non-Western states' histories, interactions, and worldviews. And I think that's a really powerful way to teach IR. I think it does students a really good service when we introduce them to sort of these non-Western principles, either as the foundational view of a course or as an equal partner in seriousness to the work that we're already teaching. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Meredith. And while I'm preparing the next question, just a note that Jennifer Scuba asked if we could type the names of the books in the chat. So
yeah, happy to.
If you don't mind doing that now, that'd be great. As we move on, I wanted to highlight something that Meredith and Kelly wrote in their piece, where they wrote, there is a pervasive and corrosive tendency among white scholars to assume that scholars of color study race, ethnicity, and identity politics in the United States or in an area studies context. And that just really resonates with my experience. I've been on faculty search committees in international relations since 1991. I was a dean from 2011 to 2017. And I've just seen over and over assumptions made about what a job candidate should look like. This is something that Meg Guliford wrote about in 2018 in the Washington Post in a piece titled, "Even Progressive Academics Can Be Racist." And, you know, area studies used to be central to the IR field when I was in grad school. And pretty much after I was done with grad school, were started to be looked down upon rather than valued. I don't think there's causation there. Which was too bad for me as somebody who was trained as an area studies expert. But, you know, they've tended to get ignored for a long time, except when the expertise is narrowly focused on US foreign policy rather than on other countries. We all know that an IR scholar who wants to publish a piece on lessons learned from John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, has no trouble publishing in IR journals, whereas somebody who works in the field on foreign policy of South Africa or Brazil is more likely to be seen as an area studies scholar, not as an IR scholar. And this is something we talked about in the May webinar that I mentioned with Arturo Sotomayor from George Washington, who's a security studies expert. So I wanted to segue from that to Robbie, because Robbie, you also wrote recently a great piece in Foreign Policy, and you wrote, quote, "Racism should be conceived as both a domestic and a foreign policy issue," end quote. And you noted, for example, that the United States not only dragged its feet in signing the Genocide Convention, but still hasn't passed anti-lynching legislation. And you've also written elsewhere, quote, "Modern liberal education is complicit in committing epistemic injustice. Such an injustice refers to the ways in which some racialized groups are deemed competent to cultivate the public sphere, while others are deemed incompetent to do so," end quote. I just wanted to ask you how we can bring some of these ideas together to better understand and teach international relations.
Thanks, Jim. And it's awesome to hang out with all my colleagues here. I think the way to answer that is actually to build on what Meredith was talking about, the distinction between race as a perspective and race as shaping. And I think we really need to expand our understanding about race, what it means, what its salience is. 15th century La Raza has a whole set of different meanings. It's a coarse threading cloth. It's a skewed line in the poem. 16th century, it becomes a degenerative line of hereditary, and that's mainly kind of religiously coded, i.e. Jews, Muslims, and heathens have degenerate heredity compared to European Catholics. And then the only way that you can kind of overcome possibly that degenerate heredity is through conversion. So then the whole question becomes, who has the reason to be able to understand the good news of Jesus Christ? So race actually comes to us as a kind of project which attributes to a whole set of humanity a degenerative heredity and the incompetency to reason. And that incompetency to reason is really important, and it runs through all the subfields of political science. Political theory, you know, from the Renaissance and Enlightenment, all through those texts, you get this distinction between the properly human, the one who's able to be educated in the ancient humanities tradition, humanitas, and as they're able to be educated in that, they can reason adequately in order to pursue justice and rights. And then they're the anthropos, the not properly human, who just can't do the same. And the evidence base for this political theory from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment is travelogues of missionaries, conquistadors, and adventurers. You can think about political behavior, you know, coming into its own in the late 19th century. In the US context, that's a moment of eugenics, an expanded empire, increased and diversified migration, urban industrialization, the 14th Amendment, which gives black people citizenship. All this is met as a fear that the body politic is degenerating because its race is being corrupted and mixed. And then the proposition becomes that only the Anglo-Saxon people, only those with Anglo-Saxon heredity, are fitted with the mental capacity and even the emotional competency to partake in democracy responsibly, right? And if you think about political behavior nowadays, what conversations are we having? We're having conversations about genes, about whether conservatism or liberalism is transmitted in the genes, whether Muslims are inherently wreckers of democracy, whether black people can't comport themselves adequately on the public sphere. All these kind of things. Comparative politics is the same. That comes out of the national security state post-World War II, focusing on the political development of the decolonizing world and which way these independent states would go. And then through the modernization theses, these native elites become coded as kind of stretched between tradition and modernity, and the fact that they're between stools make them produce irrational and reactionary policy programs which end up skewing them over towards the communists, and then eventually the Iranian Revolution is supposedly the thing which caps this all off. And then of course in IR we've got this long history now, a historiography of the field with people like Bob Vitalis and others, who show that it comes out of a defense of good imperial governance. And good imperial governance is about interdependency of white polities and independency of non-white populations. So all of this is germane to the field of political science itself, right? And it's about who's competent, who's not competent to think rationally and with general consequences about the contemporary world. And it's all about the racialization of that competency. I mean, let me just finish these comments, and I'm stretching it, but I just want to give a big kind of vista for our conversation, right? If you think back to the famous debate between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois about what black people should learn in college, you know, Booker T. Washington is all about a technical education, and Du Bois is saying, no, black people should learn what white people learn. They should learn the humanities, the classics, you know, everything which fits people to be active citizens. And of course, at the time that Du Bois is writing and after the 1860s, most black people who go to the new colleges, they want to learn the classics. They want to learn the Greeks and the Romans, literature, law, all that kind of stuff. And it's not because they want to become good Greeks or Romans. It's because the criteria for determining whether someone is human is whether someone can reason competently. And the test for that at that point of time, and I would say now, is whether they can read the Greeks and the Romans. Right? So if we hold all this in our head, engaging with the question of race in political science is all at once about requiring an engagement with social, political, and economic inequalities caused by settler colonialism and slavery, redressing of representation and discrimination issues on campus, and at the same time, and this is really important because it's not cancel culture, it's the prospecting of a more imaginative, expansive, and rigorous social science which is adequate for the age that we're living in.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll come back to some of these themes. Paul, Robbie's mention of Du Bois ties into the question I wanted to ask you about Woodrow Wilson, given all the writings that Du Bois did early in the 20th century. And just, of course, mention to start off that, you know, if people are not following you on Twitter, Prof. Paul Poast, they should be for the epic threads that you engage with on Twitter. And in fact, I noticed somebody referred to it as the Postal Service, P-O-A-S-T-A, which I liked. On June 21st, you did one on the role of World War I in the development of the academic study of international relations. And you noted Woodrow Wilson's attitudes toward World War I were heavily shaped by race. And again, you know, Robbie's mention of Du Bois, his very important writings on race and World War I. We've seen, of course, in recent weeks that Wilson's name has now been taken down from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. But when we teach IR, despite the fact that Wilson resegregated the federal government and planned for a post-war world that would leave racial hierarchies intact, when we talk about him in IR, he's typically labeled an idealist or a liberal. And so that's a little jarring when you think about his politics and policies. So how do you teach Wilson? And what does a deeper understanding of his views and his presidency mean for how we teach topics like realism and liberalism?
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to say that this is really an honor to be part of this panel. I think this is an important topic, and I can't think of a better group of scholars to bring together colleagues to be able to talk about this issue. So I want to thank you again, Jim, for organizing this and pulling this together. First of all, I want to just build directly on a point that Robbie ended with, which is, I would say, bringing this topic into the classroom doesn't just make for a more expansive social science, it makes for a more engaging social science. I've actually found where the students, when these topics are brought in, it brings them more into the subject matter. And Wilson is a very good example, and so I'm glad that you asked about Wilson. So in some ways, Wilson's tough, because on the one hand, as you pointed out, his ideas are so closely tied to internationalism, international organization. People talk about Wilsonianism. I think back to 2003, 2004, when they were criticizing the Bush administration with Iraq, they were contrasting it with Wilsonian idealism and internationalism and so forth. So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, he was a staunch white supremacist. And this is the reason why his name has been pulled off of the policy school at Princeton. And it's not even possible to say, well, his white supremacist views influenced his domestic policy, but it didn't play a role in his foreign policy. It's not possible to do that. Quite the contrary. His deeply white supremacist views very much influenced his foreign policy views. This is a major reason, as I highlight in that thread, about why he viewed the war unfolding in Europe as a problem, and a problem that had to be addressed, was because he viewed this as a danger to the white world, to white civilization. And he's very explicit about this, so much so that in the memoirs of some of his cabinet members, they're a little taken aback when he comes out and really talks about these views. So that's what makes it tricky, is exactly what you point out, is that on the one hand, he's very much associated with these ideals of internationalism, but influence his foreign policy as well. And so the question becomes, how does one grapple with this? And in particular, how does one grapple with the entity that's most closely associated with Wilson, which is the League of Nations, right? How does one deal with that? And how do I deal with that in the classroom? And again, it's tricky, but here's what I do. What I do is I emphasize to the students that it's important to think about Wilson's motivations for wanting to become involved in the war, or in some ways not wanting to become involved in the war. And I can come back to that in a moment. It's important to kind of say, here were his motivations, here was his views, which were very much informed by his white supremacist worldview. And then what was his proposed solution to that problem, regardless of what the problem was and how he came about it. And the proposed solution was in many ways very much informed by his time as a professor of public administration and so forth. So I think that's one point I take, is can we think about the League of Nations, the idea of the League of Nations, and can we approach that, given that, and at the same time acknowledging that it came out of this worldview of there's a problem in Europe, why he views it as a problem, and then why he proposes this as a solution. So that's the first thing I do, is I really try to tell the students that we should try to think about it this way. And if we approach the League of Nations as an ideal or as an idea, then that's where realism and liberalism comes in. And then that can lead into the great debates or controversy about whether there actually was a great debate or what have you, about, okay, could the idea of a League of Nations, and I should add, not necessarily the League of Nations as it actually came to be. This is another thing that people have been talking about, is whether from the mandate system to Wilson's rejection of the racial equality clause. So not the League of Nations as it maybe actually came about, but the idea of a League of Nations. That's where then you can have your isms, if you will, engage it. The other thing I do is as I've kind of hopefully made clear in what I've been saying here, I don't shy away from Wilson's racial views. In fact, I very much put it out there for the students. One thing that I've noticed that kind of gets the students' attention is I don't just come out right away and say, well, hey, Woodrow Wilson, as many of you know, white supremacist view, which they do, especially given the controversy or what's now happened with Princeton University. Instead, what I do is I start off by laying out how the World War I, or at the time the Great War, was indeed viewed by contemporaries as a white war. So I cite Du Bois. But then also, I also bring in like the British government themselves. This was actually a recruitment campaign throughout the empire, was come and support your white comrades. So by putting that out there, it makes it that this is being viewed as a white war. Then I show the students a quote, and the quote is basically the quote of saying that it would be a crime for us, it would be a crime against civilization, being the only white country that's not involved in this war, for us to get involved in the war. And I put that quote there. I don't say who it's from. And then I reveal that it's from Wilson. And at that point, then the students are like, wow, okay, I see where this is playing a role. I see how this comes in. So to summarize, overall, I think it's a great question because of the fact that Wilson, his ideas, and especially the League of Nations are such a central point of what we discuss in international relations and how the field developed in international relations. And for me, I don't try to shy away from Wilson's white supremacist views. If anything, I use it to help further illustrate why he had the motivations he did. But I also try to have the students then say, let's try to separate as much as we can his motivations for doing something from what he thought was the solution from it. And then at that point, let's try to engage this using the various isms.
You know, it's interesting because I wrote something recently on George Kennan, and you know, I've often taught Kennan and have in more recent years been trying to really consciously do the same thing. I mean, you know, where I might have made passing reference to Kennan's own views previously on issues of race, you know, I mean, his views on women, on race, I mean, his personal views were quite appalling. And they do, in fact, inform the way he talks about a lot of things. For example, I mean, in his case, just the way he thought about Southern and Eastern Europeans versus West Europeans. I mean, even within white Europeans, he had gradations. And I think, you know, I mean, again, he's taught, of course, as a classic realist, the way Wilson is as a classic liberal. And, you know, we just can't leave these issues out because it does inform who they were and what they thought. And the students need to try to grapple with that as they grapple with their legacies. Meg, you and I are at policy schools, and you know, you've taught undergrad classes at Tufts. You've TA'd for grad classes at Fletcher. You're doing a policy school, finishing a policy school PhD. And you know, at Fletcher, at AUSIS, you know, at the Elliott School where I was before, you know, we talk all the time about how we are training future leaders, and you know, at the master's level, we're very focused on this notion that we're training the next generation of policy professionals for the schools that have PhD programs like yours and mine, you know, where we talk about training the next generation of policy scholars. And just curious, your thoughts on what these policy schools need to do to really live up to that notion that they are, in fact, training future leaders.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate being here and being part of this panel. I think given the rhetoric you speak of with policy schools purporting to be training the next generation of global leaders or future leaders, with that comes a special responsibility. And it really starts first with leadership. And there are, I think I've identified 4 things that leadership can really do with respect to issues related to race is if they are serious about the work and wanting to integrate discussions of race and imbue it within their curriculum, they've first got to assess the institutional knowledge and understanding of race. Like, what do their faculty know? What do they understand? And where is their expertise? They then need to acknowledge those shortcomings and then acquire more knowledge and resources. So if you don't have what you need to do that work, either get faculty trained in a way, have them work with other scholars across universities, although that is adding a burden to other scholars. And oftentimes when you're speaking of race, those are usually women or scholars of color. So you need to be careful about that, or go and recruit those faculty who fill the gaps that you have. And then after you acquire that knowledge and resources, you then need to, as an administration and leadership, act with an eye towards measurable goals, and those goals have to be goals to which you can be held accountable. People need to understand that they can look at you and say, you said you were going to do these things, have you done them? That's really important, that you allow yourself to be held accountable. With respect to acknowledgement, which I think is the hardest thing for many people to do, I found two really exceptional examples in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. The first of which comes from University of Texas football coach Tom Herman, and that might be something that's outside of what you would expect, but he coaches a team that is primarily Black men, right? And on the first, he acknowledged that he coaches a team of, primarily Black men, and the UT fan base is predominantly white, and that they cannot fundamentally understand what these young men are dealing with. However, he cites very specifically the double standard, that fans will cheer when these young men score touchdowns, get sacks and interceptions. But he very specific, in this interview, he very specifically says, but do you want them to date your daughter? And will you hire them into senior leadership positions at the appropriate time that come with power and authority? If you're not willing to do that, you can't love them for 3.5 hours on a Saturday afternoon and not have those same interactions with them, or be willing to look at them as you would their white peers off the field. I thought that was a very important statement that came out on the first, very specifically. The second comes from an APSEA school leader, and his first two statements weren't great. I think he listened to a few, perhaps Black people, about what needed to happen and what he needed to say, that his statements needed to be have a little bit more oomph, and that was Dean Cohen of SICE. And on 8 June, there are a couple of things he did in this statement that were really, really important with respect to acknowledgement. The first thing was he acknowledged the difference in how people came to the United States, right? For Black Americans, our ancestors came in shackles, and in quite adverse conditions, and not by choice. But Dean Cohen was very specific about saying, my ancestors came here to seek and ultimately found freedom and opportunity. So that long history is very important. And I think within an IR context, this is something that we often forget. So for my own research, when I look at El Salvador, while the Civil War didn't have racial underpinnings, the inequality on which it rested was born of the encomienda labor system. And so I have to acknowledge that. And no, I don't have the space to go into that deeply, but I have to acknowledge from whence we came to that point. So that's very important. And Dean Cohen did that. Another thing he did was, and while yes, it is situating himself into it, but he has to in this case, is acknowledge he as a white man has never had to have the talk about how to interact with the police with his white sons. Or when he gets pulled over by the police, he doesn't have this very routinized way of going about it to ensure he gets home alive, or to actually not necessarily ensure he gets home alive, but to increase the probability that he gets home alive. And I think those are very important. And the final thing that he acknowledged is that he doesn't have to deal with 400 years of state repression, discrimination, and inequality. So these types of acknowledgement from senior leaders, whether it be a football coach before his team or Dean Cohen at SAIS are very important. So acknowledgement is one of those things that becomes increasingly important. The second has to do with faculty. Faculty need to be willing to engage with race in meaningful ways in their classroom. The number of times I've been in a classroom as a student, a TA, or as an instructor myself, where a student has raised an issue about race, and they will and they want to. I think that is something that faculty underestimate, that students are willing to have these conversations. But far too often, a student will raise a question about race, and the faculty member will respond to say, oh, it's not germane. But I would challenge, do many IR faculty have a handy definition of race in their hip pocket? Like, what does race mean? How do we conceptualize it? So you can't say it's not germane to the conversation if you can't define or conceptualize it. And I think faculty need to understand and recognize the merit in discussing race in the context of IR, specifically when we talk about, some of the basic Westphalian points about the state system. When we think about, I've sat through classrooms where we talk about the scramble for Africa, and at no point is race raised. Mm-hmm. It is really about the, offshoring competition for territory and economic gain. That is not enough, because this happened when I was a teaching assistant. The minute we got to recitation section, race came up immediately. And without faculty having a grounding and being willing to engage, that very question that came up in lecture, as a TA, you're kind of hamstrung. And I saw that Dan Solomon had a question about this, and we can talk about this later, Dan, about how to engage in those conversations when it's outside the scope of what a professor has allowed to take place in their classroom. The same thing is in classes about conflict in Africa. Sat through an entire one of those and never was race raised. So in the same way that in the early part of the century we started talking about mainstreaming gender, we need to mainstream race because it is a huge thing, because I'm a Black woman. I will never be anything but a Black woman. And so when you have conversations about gender, if you're talking about it from a white woman's perspective, it is very different for me as a Black woman, and those things have overlap. And then especially when you're talking about Black trans women now on top of that, that's a bigger issue. With respect to their student body, schools have to actively recruit a broader swath of students. That is just, the long and short of it. For IR, too many schools in the APSEA system rely too heavily on the Pickering and Rangel fellowships. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's not enough of a pool there, because they're constrained by how many fellows they can have. But also on top of it, not every Black and brown student wants to be a U.S. diplomat. Mm-hmm. Like, that's just, they don't want to do it. And that should not in any way prohibit them from being recruited. And also, going to HBCUs alone is insufficient. So when you say your recruiting effort, you're like, oh, we went to HBCUs, we're fine. No, that's not enough. There are a lot and increasingly more Black and brown students at primarily white institutions. So you work through Black student unions, you work through those organizations that are set up for that very purpose. Finally, white students, they need to learn to be okay with discomfort, in a classroom when you're talking about race. Because as a Black and brown students are largely uncomfortable in classrooms, and we have to figure out a way to learn in that environment. And I think we so often talk about safe spaces, but discomfort is not synonymous with unsafe spaces. That's where you can learn and gain a great deal of insight. But in order to do this, it requires facilitating this sort of conversation among students actually requires a willing faculty member who is willing to kind of get in the trenches and have these conversations, but also a faculty member that has top cover from their leadership. So it really goes from leadership down and up. I mean, it really is a leadership issue. And then overall with the scholarship addressing race, whoa, it's more than a control variable. Like, it is so much more than a control variable. And you know, interrogating the implications of race requires more than adding this random variable that really oftentimes doesn't mean much, especially in a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. Adding it as a control, we need to be able to do more and have nuanced, contextualized conversations within IR scholarship about race. That shouldn't fall to our Americanist colleagues. It really is something we've got to learn how to do and grapple with. And with that, you know, I leave you with that and can't wait for the rest of the conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much. And just add to your point about, you know, sort of uncomfortable conversations in class for students. These can be uncomfortable for faculty as well, and that's okay. Faculty should be able to handle uncomfortable conversations. I think a lot of faculty, you know, they want to stay in control. They don't want to get uncomfortable. And, you know, the world's uncomfortable. So we need to make sure that we're bringing that discomfort into the classroom for all of us, students and faculty alike. And it's also a great segue into my question for Anjali, because you teach introductory courses at Fordham. I encourage people to go to your website where you talk about your teaching. You have a great description about teaching intro to international studies. You look at the impact of international affairs on regional and local context. You discuss colonialism and imperialism. You provide an interdisciplinary perspective. And you've also noted on social media and in the earlier diversity and inclusion webinar we did in May, you talked about how you know, you're teaching at a university where your classes are majority non-white, which is very different from many of the rest of us. And ask what you've learned about how we should teach race in IR from the experience of teaching at Fordham.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be having this conversation with you. I just want to begin by noting that I'm really not qualified to talk about how we should specifically teach race in IR because I'm not an expert on race and international relations. But for the reasons that you just mentioned, Jim, I have thought a lot about how to teach introductory IR given that it is an inherently raced discipline. And there are a couple of things I want to put on the table before I move to the rest of my points, keeping Robbie and Meg's points in mind as well. First, I am not really a critical or interpretivist or ethnographic scholar as well. So the things that I have to say should be folded in the basket of this is going to be a different consideration and a different set of questions from that perspective. Second, I'm of South Asian descent. I am not Black, I'm not Latina, I'm not Indigenous. Those things matter a great deal when we talk about race in the academy, because so often my presence is used to substitute for other forms of diversity first. And second, because of the questions that Robbie just raised, right, my contingent proximity to whiteness ends up being an important part of how I consider race in the classroom when my students occupy very different categories than I might. But given all that, because not only am I not white, but the majority of my students are not white, our positions vis-a-vis mainstream international relations is necessarily going to change the nature of learning about international relations. Our conversations about the discipline are necessarily going to be reflexively critical, even though I'm not a critical scholar. And there are three big takeaways I want to highlight from that experience. The first is that my positionality as an instructor vis-a-vis the material and vis-a-vis my students defines the classroom. The second is that the assumed neutrality of whiteness in mainstream international relations is not something you have to unearth or reveal or correct for when it's your experience and when it's the lived experience of your students as well. Related to that, you're under no obligation to teach your students explicitly racist texts when racism is absolutely the lived experience of your students. The third set of points I want to raise goes to your question about the way I teach an interdisciplinary course. I think it's actually easier to do all of this when you treat introductory international relations as an inherently interdisciplinary endeavor, rather than solely as like the fourth branch of contemporary American political science. I want to begin by talking about positionality. We all have a way in which our race and gender and class interact with the texts we read and the research we do and the way we teach our students, whether that's sort of something we consider deeply or something we know we have, right? For me, it wasn't until I was teaching international relations that I had the experience of being in a majority-minority classroom, right? That was the first time I'd ever had this experience. Now, I am a not white person, right? As a reader and a teacher of international theories, I sit on one side of Du Bois's color line, right? I have to see the inherent racism in, say, Woodrow Wilson's formulation of the League of Nations, because those texts are about me, right? There's no way around the fact that the intellectual history of liberalism is bound up in the extension of empire, right? Or that John Stuart Mill was administering the ancestral villages of my family, right? Or my grandparents who raised me were all born as subjects and not citizens of an empire, right? So I really have no choice but to read these texts as a person who recognizes that they are indebted at their core to projects of controlling the periphery from which my family emerges.
Whoops.
Right.
Oh, you froze there for a sec, sorry.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. In the classroom and in the US domestic context, right, it's really deeply relevant that I am not Black or Latina or the child of very recent immigrants from South Asia or the Middle East or Northern Africa. My family has been here since 1962. Many of my students occupy very different positions. They experience the contemporary dimensions of state control and governance very differently than I do. But because I'm dark, they sometimes assume that I'm going to have the same experiences they have had. And in that situation, I absolutely owe them not a mistaken sense that I can understand every position from which they're interrogating the theories and the structures of power that I'm helping them walk through, but the solidarity of trying to see what they see, right? That's particularly important because thinking of Robert Vitalis's work, right? I'm explicitly trained in the tradition of Morningside Heights and not Sugar Hill, right? I'm explicitly trained in the tradition of Georgetown and not Shaw. I lack the immersion in the traditions of Black internationalism and the other meaningful counter-traditions from which international relations could be fundamentally reimagined. So I have to think through the process of teaching this and teaching how this is an inherently race discipline in different ways. Now, that's going to bring me to my second point about the assumed whiteness of international relations, right? In a majority not white classroom led by a not white instructor, like the way in which so much international relations assumes white neutrality and racial hierarchy and the marginalization of the global majority isn't a subtext, right? It's not something to be recovered or reintroduced. It's not a correction I have to make. It's the text, right? If you're reading it from that position, it's the thing that explicitly says your life is worth less than someone else's, or your home is unimportant, or your marginalization in the world is just the price of security. And I never have to point out what categories of person some body of scholarship assumes is neutral, or what categories of exclusion an author can just wave away. If something is racist, students will not just point it out. They will have experienced it, right? And this is what I think is often missing from discussions about whether or not we should teach particular racist texts or how we should teach race in IR. It's the idea that racism in these texts is not hypothetical or abstract or of only intellectual interest to a lot of your students. If we were to assume that the instructors and a majority of students were not white, then a lot of the submerged, racialized dialectics of control, they aren't submerged anymore in IR theories, right? They're your grandparents born as colonial subjects, or they're your uncles whose lives aren't just collateral death because they were born in Yemen, or they're your articles of faith being dropped into structural theories that try to explain conflict, or they're your mother whose marginalized place in like multiple hierarchies of race and gender and class is just something constantly visible to you because you help her navigate the state. And in those situations, teaching international relations is teaching a critical interrogation of international relations theories. And if that doesn't define your classrooms, if your classrooms are majority white, or if you're right, then you might ask what categories of readers and students you're assuming can be neutral towards these texts. Who is being excluded? Whose bodies stack up on the edges of particular theories, right? Who gets to be the unnamed and uncounted dead in the articles that you're reading? How can their perspectives be rendered whole? And that's going to bring me to my last point, which is that I think particularly if you're not a critical or interpretive scholar or a scholar of race and IR, a comparatively straightforward way to manage this is to think of this as being a meaningfully interdisciplinary endeavor, right? I teach two different introductory classes, which is a long story, but I teach an interdisciplinary international relations course and a standard international relations course. The interdisciplinary one moves from the big questions that Jim laid out about nation and state, about colonialism and imperialism, about globalization and local economies, to work on the 5 social science disciplines and history, sort of walking through the logics of explanation, and then back to sort of regional contexts. And from that perspective, I find it's quite easy to reimagine these questions. Reframing this as a series of questions about the world that we can see play out in specific places, using multiple different tools, is a really straightforward way for even introductory students to ask really complicated questions about race and hierarchy and power. Because American IR so often assumes, in the way it's organized, it privileges the role of states and not of peoples, right? It highlights domination instead of solidarity. It starts out with this simple minimalist story about city-states and Westphalia and anarchy, instead of with a rich, complicated story about empire and global exchange and variation and cooperation and co-optation and exploitation, right? But starting with questions is one straightforward way, if you lack the same immersion I lack in sort of fundamentally reimagining international relations, to give students tools to sort of engage with these questions.
Fantastic. And I'm sure as we've been going along that the panelists who spoke earlier have reactions to some of the things that folks have said later. And so we're going to do, I have a question for Kim, and then we're going to, I'm going to bring in some of the questions that we've gotten from attendees. And in answering those, if you also wish to bring in other thoughts you've had as you've heard others speak, please feel free to do that. So Kim, you are not just a great scholar and teacher, but you also engage in politics and policy in your areas of expertise. And I wanted to ask how you think about the different ways you bring your expertise and your lens on race in IR and comparative politics to bear, not just in what you do in the classroom, but outside of it, and especially when you write for non-academic audiences.
Yeah, great question and great panel. I'm learning so much from my colleagues, so I'm really grateful to be with you all today. So I have probably one guiding principle that helps me in my engagement with the public. So whether that's writing posts for the Monkey Cage, which is a blog on politics and political science at the Washington Post, or I have a podcast called Ufahamu Africa. And then I do presentations in DC to various agencies that are interested in knowing something more about my research or about the places where I do research. And the guiding principle that I have is representation. So, and I'm hearing it come through in a lot of what other people are saying. You know, I recognize, you know, my own privilege in like being white passing. It's how I get the opportunities that I get. Right, that I get invited to do these things, that I get asked to be part of some of these conversations. I think a lot of people, in much the same way that Anjali is talking about positionality, I think a lot of people see me as, you know, potential friend, not foe. Right? It's like, you know, I mean, those people must not read my Twitter feed, but there's this expectation, right, that I will be respectful and respectable, and won't rock the boat, but might, you know, give people useful insights or not be a waste of their, you know, 90 minutes of time. And so knowing that I'm coming in because of that privilege, I am trying to recognize whose voices are represented in the work that I'm sharing, right? Who, you know, it's kind of like we talk about who's on our syllabi, who's cited in our research papers, you know, whose work is being called out in the pieces that I write, and not just a link of, you know, without naming the scholar, right, but an actual like recognition of the work that someone has done, right? And to give you an example, there's quite a bit of recent research that is looking at the historical legacy of colonialism and slavery to, you know, this really empirically rigorous work to say things that Walter Rodney said decades ago, right? So when I talk about, the legacy, the historical legacy of colonialism or of slavery, right? I don't just cite the predominantly white male scholars who have been doing this, recently published rigorous work, right? I talk about the work that was done by Black scholars before that, right? So when I write something for the public, I try to recognize, like, here's this thing that's really important that a lot of people care about, and now it's getting published in top journals, right? But people were saying this before. And who are those people, and how can we bring their voices into the conversation? How can we recognize, right, our scholarly lineage, even if we didn't recognize them when they were alive or when they were in our in our academies. And I think some of this is also reflected in the question raised by Sitembile Mbete in the Q&A about, he or she, they're writing from South Africa and saying, like, how do we do this if, all of the canon is kind of Western versions of IR, even, who's even at the table talking about, like, look at all of us in the room, right? In this webinar, who is actually physically located in the global South? Right. So it's hard for me, as someone who studies politics primarily in Africa, to just talk about, places and peoples in Africa without those places and peoples being present. Right. So often, for example, I do a lot of research on Malawi. So if I write for the public about Malawi, a landlocked country in Southern Africa, where I've had the privilege to do a great deal of research, I don't write it on my own, right? So sure, I could represent Malawian voices. And I think, when I was like a baby political scientist, this is what I was like, oh, I've done survey data, so Malawian voices are represented. Yeah, but who's writing the questions? Who's determining which questions are even important to be asked? I am. And what do I know? I'm not from Malawi, right? So one of the most fruitful things I've done is collaborated equally with my Malawian colleagues, and writing not just academic papers, but also public engagement pieces. And because those voices are represented, just like Robbie was saying, the work that we do, both academic and for the public, is much more imaginative, because it's not limited or confined to the settler colonial education I received in the United States, right? There's much more richness to it. But not just that, right? To bring out, again, what Paul was saying earlier, we can engage a whole different audience, right? We are, by having this increased representation of voices, we have more people we can draw to. Like, sure, the Washington Post has an average reader that's a white male in his 50s who has a college education. I'm not writing for that guy. I'm perfectly happy for that guy to read my pieces, right? And I'm perfectly happy to write my work in a way that is accessible to that guy. And having gone through an education, a K through PhD education that mirrors a lot of what that guy experienced, I know, right? I know that canon, right? I know the frameworks that are legible to that guy, and maybe I'll include those as a way to bring that person in, but I don't owe anything to that guy, right? I'm not writing for him, right? I'm writing for my mother and people like her, right? But for, the historical inequality, would have this same, ability to subscribe to the Washington Post, and the same ability to have, had all of the education that led that person to the kind of successful life that they had. So I think that if we think about public engagement, it's not to think about the average, person of influence, right? It's to imagine a broader audience and to meet them where they are, and to recognize how and I think this builds on what Anjali is saying, and maybe it's because I no longer teach at a primarily white institution. I teach at a place where it's a minority student body, and a non-white student body, and so it matters to me that we are, as academics, creating scholarship and public engagement that reflects some bit of their lived experiences, that is true to their lived experiences. And I don't think that's just for them, though that's an audience I want to reach. I think that's beneficial for everyone, right? If we want to expand our ideas about what international studies or international relations means. And I think part of it is, who's in the room, who's getting cited, who's, Laura C. and I run this book series every summer, the African Politics Summer Reading Spectacular. And we had to work really hard in the first couple of years of the series to include African authors, and that's because, unfortunately, in our youth, we thought you had to go with the top presses, right? Who's Cambridge publishing? Who's Oxford publishing? And as we were doing that, we're like, you know what? Cambridge and Oxford aren't publishing everyone. And I got a PhD, and I've been teaching for a while, so I think I have the capacity to determine for myself what are good ideas and what is compelling evidence. And I don't need Cambridge on the binding to tell me that a book has good ideas or has good evidence. And once I think we got into that, we could expand our idea of what books are included. You don't have to even be an academic to have good ideas and compelling evidence, right? You can be a fiction writer. You can be an analyst who, because of the role of gatekeeping in academia, never went to get a PhD or never completed one, right? And of course now, I'm not saying that's the only way to bring in African voices. And of course now, if you look at our series, there's people like Omar Ba and Lina Ben Abdallah and Ken Apollo. There are more African voices in the series with Cambridge on the binding, but I think that we as scholars, and we think about how we reach a large audience and how we inform them about international relations, international studies, we just have to, who are we citing, whose work are we highlighting, whose voices are being heard.
That's great. And just so you know, Kate Weaver, while you were speaking, posted that she's found out about a lot of Global South scholars from following your Twitter feed. So that's great. And I'm also glad that you mentioned that Sithambile had a question. She and I were together in Berlin in January. I think that was the last time I was out of the US. We were also together at ISA the year before in 2019, and it seems like a previous life. And I hope that I look forward to that future life again once we can all be back. We do have a bunch of questions that have come in. So the first one I'm going to do, because I know we have a lot of PhD students on, and we had a couple from grad student TAs, one from Anna Meyer. For grad student TAs who often have minimal or no input on the syllabi for the classes they teach, what can we do to make our classrooms anti-racist? And are there things we can do if we're working with an unsympathetic faculty member? And Daniel Solomon, who also is a PhD student, also asked, curious about teaching this at the TA level, where we mainly have control over the content of discussion sections rather than the general course design, especially given the additional burdens that students are facing amid COVID-19. Do panelists have recommendations for how TAs can engage students in these discussions in a way that complements existing course material? And I would just note, as somebody who has taught Intro to IR with TAs, I think it's a good idea for a faculty member teaching with TAs to ask TAs for their input before putting the syllabus together. I think that would be helpful. But does anybody have any reactions to those great questions from our from two of the PhD students. Yeah, Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's kind of tough from multiple perspectives. So I know, for example, at the University of California, our students are represented by a union, and so there are rules governing their work, and they're contracted to do work during the term, not before the term. So I know that for me, I struggle with not wanting to give them any work beforehand and asking someone to go over my syllabus in advance. You know, I'm really hesitant to do that. But I recognize, you know, there are colleagues of mine, you know, I've seen their syllabi, you know, it's not good, you know, and they need someone to correct them. And I feel for the TAs who then have to go into the classroom, you know, especially because PhD students are more diverse than faculty. Right. And so here you are, like an emissary of the white professor who's teaching the canon. Right. And you look probably more like your students. And how do you navigate that? I think that, you know, if you feel comfortable having a conversation with a faculty member before the term begins can be useful. It's not your job, right? So you need to do, as a TA, you need to decide for yourself, you know, what are you comfortable doing? What do you want to do? What do you think is important? How, you know, and if that's important, I think communicating to the faculty in advance. I want to say though, that not everyone is a friend, right? So people are, especially people who've benefited from racist systems, they're, you know, strongly committed to keeping the systems as they are. And it is work for a professor to change their syllabus. One single reading is work. And so so I just want to caution students, because you are in a more precarious position, you know, just because you're right, and you're working on the force of good, it doesn't mean that there won't be consequences for you. And I don't want to, and I think this is particularly true for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and for women, that that doing so is, it could create backlash for you professionally and personally. And I think, you know, for the PhD students who are white allies, maybe this is your time to stand up and ask questions about it, and not leave it to the Black, Indigenous, or person of color TA that you are working with. You know, if you feel that's what you should do, then you know, but I think, you know, it's really on us as faculty, and more so, it's really on administration to incentivize and to reward this kind of work, in order for faculty to buy into it.
I take the friendly wrist slap on not asking my TAs to do anything before the class starts, so I appreciate that. Just trying to think. I mean, so let's say they haven't had a chance to participate in the building of the course, which I take your point, they shouldn't unless they're being paid for it. I know when Mike Schroeder and I taught Intro to World Politics together in the fall 2016, we had a weekly meeting with our TAs just as a group to just go over sort of what we were trying to do that week in class and sort of what they were hearing. And I think being open, creating an environment in which they feel like they can speak freely and openly, if they feel like you are not, if they feel like they could improve the way in which you're teaching a subject, you know, and that's tough. I mean, especially, I mean, I was the dean in that case. I mean, you know, who wants to say anything negative to me? Well, people did, but it's hard. And, you know, it's important to create that environment. I see, Meg, did you have something? And then Anjali.
I did. And I think part of it is understanding what your faculty wants your students, those students, to get out of those recitation sections is really important. But one thing that was very helpful to me was using anecdotes. So when you're having conversations about riots and massacres, don't necessarily just look for one that's international. I talked about Tulsa. When you talk about violence against civilians, we talked about Emmett Till, like, because it was something that many of them may have known the name, but to understand the context and various different aspects of it, I brought those into play. So a lot of it can be your anecdotes, but ultimately it is the faculty's course. It is the faculty's course, and you have to, in many respects, honor that, because Kim's right. The repercussions for that can be enormous, because especially if this person is your advisor, your committee, you're going to need them for a very long time. So you want to tread lightly in those spaces. But also for me, as a Black woman, I can't shed that. So if we're talking about the Rwandan genocide, and one of the questions the professor had, I want them to talk about race. And I was like, well, what about race? This is something that came up. Well, what about race? Race. Well, they're looking at a Black woman. It's going to be a very different exchange than if they're looking at you, Jim. So it's how to position myself and craft those questions. That is a great chance I took it as a great opportunity to learn how to navigate in a classroom talking about issues of race, where the question was essentially, did race play a role in the lack of intervention in, Rwanda? Well, of course, every one of them is going to look at me and be like, yes, of course. And I'm like, they may not believe that. And in many cases, they couldn't argue it. And so that became problematic. So it's a good opportunity to figure out how you position yourself in a classroom, as well as, you may co-teach a course at some point, and you may be at odds with that. You may be co-teaching because you are pedagogically and theoretically, empirically distinct from your colleague. These are times that you can really start working on that. But anecdotes become really powerful tools to use in this case that can illustrate the learning that the professor wants to do without going outside of the scope of what they want the students to understand.
Great. Anjali, we'll go to you. And then Robbie, there are a couple questions, sort of UK, European, broader context. And since you've taught in both the UK and in the US, it'd be interesting to hear sort of either differences in the experiences or any commonalities. But Anjali, why don't you go ahead with this, and then we'll go into the next question.
I'll keep it brief. Just picking up on Kim and Meg's points, one way to imagine this is as a principal agent problem, right? The professor is the principal in this case, and you are the professor's agent. And a lot is going to matter on what you think of the agent, right? Whether you think that they are retaliatory, whether you think that they are perhaps inclined to want to do the thing that you were doing, but not want to do the work, right? And then assessing what kind of space you have to do something that bridges the two perspectives, right? So it may be that, for example, in discussion sections, you have more latitude to talk about things that you think are important, depending on who the professor is. It may be that, in fact, you are not necessarily going to be able to do that much with the syllabus that you have or the class that you're being asked to teach. And that's an uncomfortable situation, but when we think about your position in these hierarchies of power, that is not your fault, right? And I think that's a really important thing to remember. You are not responsible for a situation where you're teaching a syllabus that you would never have written, right? And to the extent that it is safe or possible for you to do so, you can integrate the kind of class that you would have taught, provided you're not undermining the actual learning goals of the course, which is not necessarily going to help your students either, right? So that if you're facing that situation, to the extent that it's possible to pick up IR theories and drop them into pedagogy is one way to think about it, right? Think of yourself as being the agent for a principal whose attributes are going to vary, and thinking about how you can approach that problem that way.
Great. Before I go into the questions for Robbie, I did want to highlight Denise Horn had a point about, she said, I've been on several book prize committees. We need to make sure it's not just Cambridge and Oxford blasting the committee with their books, as reference to a point that Kim was making about those great presses, but they're not the only presses. And just amen. I mean, I was on 2 book prize committees this spring, the Sartori Prize Committee for APSA and the Katzenstein Book Prize for Cornell. And I mean, Cornell and Oxford just flooded the zone. It was just sort of overwhelming, the percentage of books that were just from those 2 presses compared to what was available from other presses. And more voices are important. So 2 questions. I mean, they're not exactly the same, but we're going to put them together here a little bit. So one, Alex Betley, I'm curious if you all think American IR has anything to learn from IR in the UK, European continent. And then John Esconis, how can especially American IR scholars engage with and teach the different modalities of racism and hierarchy that emerge from different imperial and colonial structures? I'm concerned that even in this very necessary conversation that the American racial modality is being overlaid and exported in ways that distort the politics and history of both Europe and the global South and reinforce an American-centric RA. So Robbie, we'll start with you, and
yeah,
especially given your having taught in both the European, UK and US context.
Yeah, I've taught on 3 continents:
Okay.
Australasia, Europe, and North America.
Sorry.
No, it's cool. So this is something which is quite close to me. I mean, I think the first thing is that where you're standing is you have to bring the world to where you're standing, right? So if one doesn't do so, then you're kind of ethically and intellectually going against some of the main kind of predicates of doing critical race theory, right? So it's not a problem to do what Meg was talking about anecdotes. If you're teaching in the US, right? If you're teaching in New Zealand, that's a different thing. If you're teaching in France, that's a different thing. But where you're standing, you have to try and bring the world to where you're standing, right? And you can dispute the nationalisms, right? In that very process, you can dispute the nationalisms. So one of the big things I find is that one of the payoffs for Black studies is that it basically Americanized and nationalized the study of race, right? And the study of Blackness as well, from the 70s onwards. Yeah. And that becomes a problem even for IR, even if you're doing US stuff, because that's one of the key reasons why IR doesn't include race, because it's hived off to Black studies, which is seen as a domestic African American pursuit, right? Which of course it wasn't for most of its histories, right? And when it first made the demand to come into the academy, it certainly wasn't a nationalistic demand, right? It was a social justice, global justice demand. So that's one thing. The other thing is the paradox that I was born and grew up in the UK. We had our bus boycotts in towns like Bristol, but the only bus boycott we ever got taught was the Montgomery one. Right. Now in the rest of Europe, people complain and they say, everybody always talks about the UK. You see what I'm saying? You might be standing in South Africa or Malawi and think, everybody talks about the UK or the US. So there are hierarchies of power, of knowledge production, which run despite all the inequities and oppressions and violences which constitute those places, right? So that's an important thing to think about. And then and if you start thinking like this, like for example, if you think about the Harlem Renaissance, plenty of Caribbean people constituted the Harlem Renaissance. Where did they first get their licking of Jim Crow? It was not in the US. Many of them had worked in Colon in Panama, and Colon was a little South entrepot, right, which exported all the Jim Crow rules, yeah, and so Caribbean workers who came to Colon got a taste of the US there before they even came to the US. So if we start thinking about that, then we think, well, bring the world to where we are, right? Recognize that there are hierarchies of knowledge which are imbued in that, but also recognize that the very task of trying to bring the world to where you are actually opens it back out again. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think that, opening it back out is difficult. It's difficult. I don't think we have a global theory of race. I don't think we do. Caste. You get what I'm saying? Is race caste? I kind of think it is in some ways. But I also know class is caste. You think about Donald Trump, you think his boys ever met anyone outside of their billionaire class? You see what I mean? So, who you sleep with, who you breed with, who you work with, who you live with, if that becomes distinct enough like that, you got caste everywhere, right? So I question whether we have a global theory of race, or I would put it like this. That's the challenge to us peeps in IR. Do you see what I mean? And that challenge is met by bringing the world to where we are and then opening where we are back out again.
I wanted to see if Paul and or Meredith had any comments. We heard from them a while ago and wanted to see whether they wanted to come back in to the conversation. And I know we're only scheduled to have about 9 minutes left. We'll see where we are at 2:30. I mean, we could go all day, but I know it gets hard for folks. But Meredith, was it, or Paul, did you want to say anything, or should we go on?
Sure. I just wanted to say, and I think that this dovetails on both conversations, but really the conversation about TAs in the classroom is, I think if there's anything, I mean, there's obviously a lot to take away from this panel, but one thing that just strikes me repeatedly is how incumbent on white faculty it is to talk about race in the classroom. I mean, when you have predominantly white students, when you are a white faculty member, given what I think it was Anjali who talked about sort of this assumption of the innate whiteness of IR, given that operational assumption, it is really important that white faculty talk about race or create space to talk about race. And yes, as Kim said, it's difficult to update our syllabi. It's a pain, it takes a ton of time. That is not nearly as difficult as it is for teaching assistants to be in the position that we were just talking about, especially students of color. It's not nearly as difficult as it is for Black students, for South Asian students to sit in an IR classroom and never see themselves and their stories represented. And it's not as difficult as it is to try and explain IR without talking about race, which does an enormous disservice to our students because it's a totally incomplete picture. So I think, a call to action from this moment is to really think about the positionality of white scholars and to take that on as a really important part of moving forward with IR, because we can talk about it, but unless we reflect it in our classrooms, we're not going to see those changes down the road.
And Paul, that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about your Twitter feed is just you're trying to raise our awareness of so many different voices out there on so many topics. And I don't know how you read all the things you read, and I'm just totally a huge admirer of you, but I think that is something that I've really appreciated just following you on Twitter, is just your ability to bring those to bring things forward. And I think one of the things for me of this is really just the fact that Meredith and Kelly published their piece, and then Robbie published a piece playing off of Meredith and Kelly's piece, and then I started looking at more of what Robbie had written, and just sort of basically the way in which we go about educating ourselves and becoming more aware of people who, here Robbie and I are, within not very many miles of one another between Hopkins and American University, but just becoming more aware. So Paul, please.
I was there the other day, Jim, with Randy.
Good. Randy Prasad, my colleague, who I've just learned a ton from, of course, over the years at AU.
I mean, I just want to second the point, maybe third the point, fourth the point about communicating and listening to your TAs. I think it's important I think that's such an important point on this issue, but also on issues of gender, because let's just call it like it is. I'm a white male teaching this class. I am in a position where a lot of times my TAs are women, people of color, and it's important for me to be able to have a conversation about what are the things that you want to approach in this class. if we're going to talk about race, I run it by them ahead of time. For example, something that I know received a lot of attention when I shared it on Twitter was when I talk about the clash of civilizations, right? I brought that up and I said, how should I approach this? Especially because the Huntington thing, you know, like how far do we go with saying Huntington's clearly racist, you know, and I actually ran that by my grad students. How should we do this? How, you know, where are you comfortable with this? And so I just want to second that point that I think is very important for us as faculty to have a communication, have a dialogue with our graduate students, with our TAs, and to listen to them and encourage them to have input into the process. I just want to second that.
And I just also feel like, I mean, I'm learning so much from PhD students who I follow on Twitter. Some, you know, I've known Meg for a few years now. Anna Meyer, who asked a question earlier. I mean, I just keep thinking, oh my gosh, it'll be so great when she's a department chair someday, because that department is going to be so much better for that than whatever it is when they hire her. But seriously, I mean, I read what she's writing about, you know, issues related to the grad students at University of Wisconsin, and union issues that, you know, for example, that Kim was raising, and just, you know, really just getting a much better understanding of a lot of different issues, and just hearing. I think one of the things that's great about social media is just the ability to hear a lot of different voices out there if you try, and people that you know that you've never met in person. And I'm just adding to this. Sarah Stroop made commented on this question of faculty discomfort, and makes the point, we often feel like our role is to serve as expert, yet it has been really rewarding to increasingly serve as facilitator, where I'm not expert but willing to have the conversation, and to be generous, imperfect, curious with students on the way. And she wanted to make sure to know that the recording will be available to share, which it is, will be. We only have a few minutes left. Let me just close with this question from Dr. Sarah Taylor. This conversation has so far talked, for the most part, about the content of the modules, course, and degrees that are taught and studied. Should we not also consider the context, and my point here is about the structure itself of the modules, courses, and degrees, and perhaps approaching decolonializing or including race and engaging in anti-racism as praxis? Anybody wish to close us out on that, or on anything else? I mean, any final comments that any of the panelists wish to make, please? Kim, yes.
So I want to thank Dr. Taylor for that question. I think I think that there's some things that we have been bringing up that are consistent with that, right? Is a recognition of hierarchies of knowledge production, and I think one of the ways we can think about this is, you know, we're not all knowledge, not all ideas or evidence are going to come in the form that is typically celebrated by the academy, right? And so one of the ways I think about, for example, you know, the assignments that I have in my course, you know, I love exams and papers just like the next person, but I also recognize that the ability to do well on those is itself braced. And, you know, how can I prioritize and celebrate the other forms of knowledge and knowing? And how can I be anti-racist in the way that I assign work or evaluate the learning that my students are doing? And I think experimenting with that is useful. I'm still new to that, and I recognize I'm, you know, newly tenured, so I have a lot more freedom maybe than a lot of other people do. But I think that you know, talking about those other ways of assessing learning and of engaging your work, I think as a faculty we need to do more of that, and we can learn more from each other doing that.
Yes, Anjali.
I know we're out of time, so I'm going to be
That's okay.
really brief. Picking up on this point from Kim, but also going back to Daniel Solomon's question about teaching during pandemic conditions. One thing that I had to struggle with quite a bit in the spring semester was trying to think about what a grade was for. Because of the massive disruption to my students during the pandemic, many of them were in highly unstable situations. You know, it's not clear at that point what the goal of evaluating someone's work is. And it really did force me to think about what kinds of evaluations I was giving. What did I want? What did I need them to walk away from the class with? And what was the hoop that they needed to clear to indicate to me that they'd walked away with that knowledge, right? And for me, at least, that was an enormous inflection point in thinking about, like, I don't care how well they do on a scale of A to D or whatever. I need them to walk away from this classroom knowing 5 things. And if they can know those 5 things, then I'm going to be comfortable. Now, that's a really different way of thinking about evaluation, and it took a pandemic for me to get there because I had to. And I don't know that institutional structures, department structures are always open to that, because we evaluate students and we're discouraged from giving out too many high grades. And, you know, so I don't really know what the right answer is, but I do know that I actually think they learned more once I, like, fundamentally said, we're going to answer 5 questions. We're going to answer them every week. And then that's also going to be your final exam, right? Like, that was a better way for them to think about the class. And so I don't know really what the answer is, but between those 2 questions, sort of, that's what I would toss out. Having to reimagine evaluation in crisis actually, I think, made for a better learning experience.
Well, I really appreciate that as an ending comment, because our next, we're doing a couple book webinars, as I mentioned, but our next thematic one is on August 25th, What to Do When Your Research Gets Disrupted by COVID, thinking about PhDs who are just sort of thinking about starting on topics. Do they have to switch gears? Students who were trying to finish and had fieldwork that they still had to do. Tenure track faculty who are watching the clock nervously, even with perhaps a delay given the work. So that's on August 25th. I do want to close by saying to all the folks still on here, almost 200 folks still on, which is incredible. I emailed these 6 people to ask them if they would do this with me, and they got back to me right away. I mean, there was no hesitation. They agreed immediately. I am so grateful to them for their time and insights. I learned so much from reading them, from following them, from looking at their websites and their, you know, what they say about their mission statements. And I really have tremendously appreciated this opportunity. We're just at Bridging the Gap. We're all incredibly grateful to you. So thank you so much. And we'll let everyone know on Twitter when the recording has gone up. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim and colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.